Shalom Aleichem. Today is Yom Hamishi B'Shabbat, Thursday, Rosh Chodesh Shevat, Aleph B'Shvat, Tov Shin Peh, corresponding to the 30th of January 2025. L'minyan Ha'umoth Ha'to'im. We continue in our studies in Mishneh Torah L'Rabbanu HaGadol Rambam, Zichron Livracha, Hilchot Avoda Zarah v'Chukot HaGoyim, Perek Yod Bet, Halacha Yod Aleph. Very well, Halacha Yod Aleph. Lo ta'ada isha adeh ha'ish. כגון שתשים בראשה מצנפת או כובע, או תלבש שריין וכיוצא בו. So this is a continuation in some ways of the previous halacha. The word adi technically means an ornament, some kind of jewelry or other type of object that people wear, something which is considered beautiful or attractive. And clearly men and women wear different types of things, different adornments, different types of I can't think of the word I'm looking for. Accessories, that's the word I'm looking for. So men and women wear different types of jewelry, ornamentation, accessories, etc., and also apparel. So this isur, which is mentioned by the Rambam at the beginning of this section of halachot, which is miswa mem heth, at the end of the list of miswot at the beginning of Hilchot Avoda Zarah v'Chukot HaGoyim, Shilo ta'ada isha adi ish. And this includes not only jewelry or ornaments, etc., but also, as we say, apparel. So Rambam says, Lo ta'ada isha adeh ha'ish, kegon shetasim berosha, mitznefet o kova, the kind of headgear that are normally worn only by men. Therefore, a woman may not wear such a thing. Or tilbash shiryan v'chayotze bo, or a woman should wear some kind of suit of armor, as military men do. Now we have two girsaot here. We have or shetighaleh or shetighaleh rosha ka'ish, or that she should shave her head, as men do. One could also perhaps understand from here that it's not referring to shaving, because after all, not all men shave their heads, and nor is it possible and mutar to shave all of one's head. But it could be referring to a very, very short hairstyle, similar to that which men wear usually. That's if we read shetighaleh. If we read shetighaleh, which appears in some of the sources, then it's referring to a woman not covering her head, as men are not required to cover their heads. This is, if that's the case, this is first of all a further proof that that there is no chova, as we've discussed before, for a man to cover his head. As we saw previously, Rambam, in earlier shiurim, Rambam does discuss covering one's head during tefillah, but in general it's not required. And it's really a minhag nitkabe', a minhag that took root and became essentially a practice that one does not change, or one that one should adhere to, shall we say. With regards to a woman, women would always cover their hair. Certainly, a married woman would cover her hair. We can look later, perhaps, or another occasion, what Rambam says about an unmarried woman, young girls or teenage girls, etc. What they are required to do vis-a-vis their hair. Here, Rambam says that a woman may not dress or attire herself or make herself up in any way which is similar to that men normally would do. And from here, by the way, we also can learn that unless it is a matter of obvious and direct pikuach nefesh, a woman is not to wear military garb. And this, of course, immediately raises the question: how could someone imagine that a woman could or should serve in the army? I would allow those very learned individuals who claim otherwise, who claim that young Jewish girls should serve in the army, I will allow them to respond to that question. I will not help them out. This is, by the way, not only does this refer to carrying a weapon, which in the current situation, I would say anywhere in the world, men and women should do. But even wearing military uniform, I think should be viewed as such a practice that is asur. And this isur is a two-way street, and therefore Rambam continues, "V'lo ya'da ish adi isha." A man may not dress up in any way like a woman. Keron she'ilbosh or yilbash birdei siv'onim v'hali zahav. In other words, a man should not wear clothing. It's referring here to brightly colored clothing that were normally not worn by men, at least in those days. And I would say that this still applies today. I don't think that it's, for this reason, I did not think it's correct at all for a man to wear a bright red shirt, shall we say. I'm not saying the shirt has to be a specific color. That is not true. That's a question of style, of what you're used to, all sorts of things of that sort. But the kind of very brightly colored clothing that women tend to wear more, that should not be worn by men. Men are not. It's the opposite of the world of the peacocks. In the world of the peacocks, it's the male who is very adorned and very impressive looking, and the female considerably less so. But human beings are not peacocks. Hali Zahav refers to any kind of jewelry or adornment that women would wear. So basically, it's referring to any gold kind of jewelry. Shall we say a brooch or something like that, or an armband, or what have you. If someone were to respond, well, wait a second, didn't the Vikings wear armbands made of gold? I would say, yes, that's entirely true from what I know, but again, we are not Vikings. So in this or that society, certain things might be done. We have our own standards and styles. In other words, we see from all these halachot in general that the Jewish people, as we saw at the beginning of Perek Yod Aleph, the Jew is to be different and discernible. As we learned at the beginning of Perek Yod Aleph, and we should be different also in our dress, as Rambam wrote over there. And therefore, even if there are other people who do these things, we don't do such things. And for this reason, I do not think it is correct for a Jewish man to wear a ring on his finger, unless it is something of a practical nature with some kind of a seal on it, which was used in ancient times, or even some generations ago, perhaps. But nowadays, I think it's entirely for purposes of dressing up or what have you, and that's not a Jewish thing at all. And therefore, I do not think that a Jewish man should wear a wedding ring or a wedding band.
Rabbi,
let's finish this sentence. Just 1 second. And when is this the case? במקום שאין לובשים אותן הכלים ואין משימים אותו החלי אלא הנשים, הכל כמנהג המדינה. So a person might claim, based on the last words we just read, that what I just said a moment ago is not necessarily true. Because if lots of Jewish men are walking around wearing wedding rings, shall we say, or wearing gold chains around their necks, then you could say, and technically you would be right, that this is minhag medina. This is something which is done by many men, and therefore it's not adi isha. And again, technically you would be correct. However, the real question is, where did this practice, this idea, come from? How did it enter? At what time did it enter? By what type of people did it enter Jewish society? There is a teshuvah that I recall by Rabbeinu Avigdor Kohen, one of the Baalei Tosafot. He was originally from Ashkenaz, from Germany, and later he moved to Italy. And we have various writings from him, including some teshuvot. In the Sefer written by a different Chacham later in Italy by the name of Shibbolei Aleket, he apparently had before him quite a lot of material from Rabbeinu Avigdor Katz, and he quotes him not infrequently. And on this very topic, Rabbeinu Avigdor Katz is asked about wearing, I think it was a ring or some such item for a man, and the question was, seeing that the goyim where we live, the men do this, therefore should it not be mutar for Jews to do the same? And his response basically was, technically you are right, but lema'aseh you are not correct. In other words, he says, kama mechuneh hadavar, how inappropriate and reprehensible it is that we should learn from the customs and the fashions and the behavior of various goyim amongst whom we at one time in history, in one place, may live. That is not how things should work. We should not pick up such things. If they have been picked up by some, they can be told gently that it would be much better and more appropriate if you do not dress in that way or wear such items. And that's all there is to it, really. In other words, we should be on our guard against adopting such practices, because many of the Gentiles, or for that matter, non-Torah Jews in our area, do certain things. Yes, Leon.
Yes, I wanted to ask on the subject of Beged Ish, do you view pants as an extension of that, or is there a
Yes, thank you.
separately issue because of tzniut, or both?
Thank you for mentioning that. It had occurred to me before as I was speaking to mention women wearing pants. Yes, I do believe that wearing pants is a Beged Ish, which a woman should not wear. This is not a hidush of mine by any stretch of the imagination. There are many poskim in the last generation or so, or two, who have written about this topic, and many of them wrote exactly what I just said. That it is a Beged Ish. On top of that, it's also there's a clear issue of tzniut. When is it possible, and perhaps even desirable in some situations, for a woman to wear pants if it is covered by a skirt over it, a sufficiently long skirt which covers the pants? This is the case in some traditional societies, both Jewish and non-Jewish. Amongst women in Teiman, this was done, and also very possibly because it was also done amongst the local Arabs, and amongst the Bedouin women, this is the case in many, at least in some cases, as far as I know. So, so the question of tzniut is solved if the pants are completely covered by a skirt that would in its own right be sufficiently thanua, and we're not talking about wearing pants and they're wearing some tiny mini skirt on top of the pants. We're talking about wearing a skirt as if there were no pants, but the pants may be worn for reasons of the weather. It may be very cold, shall we say, or it might be precisely for reasons of tzniut, that it provides an extra layer of tzniut, particularly perhaps when doing certain activities or in certain places where it's very windy or what have you.
Because if pants were an issue of Beged Ish, then presumably the fact of them being tznuah or not tznuah wouldn't really matter, correct?
Well, I don't think that pants can be thanua for.
I mean, even if covered.
First of all, there are pants which are designed for women, clearly, and you could as opposed to pants which are clearly designed for men. So for a woman to wear pants designed for a woman when it is also properly covered, I think there is no reason to object to that. And this matter is not just a humrah, as some people imagine, as Rambam now tells us. Ish she'ada adi isha, isha she'adath adi ish lokim. In other words, a person is transgressing a mitzvah lo ta'aseh for doing such things, and this even could result in malkuyoth, in being lashed. This, in other words, this is a serious matter, not to be taken lightly. Similarly, In the same vein, המלקט שערות לבנות מתוך השחורות מראשו או מזקנו, a man who begins to discover that he has some white hairs, grey hairs in his beard or on his head. מי שילקט שערה אחת, from the moment that he, even removing or plucking out or somehow removing one such hair, he's chayav malkuyot mipnei she'adha adi isha. That kind of behavior is something which is common and reasonable for women and not for men. Again, men are not we are not peacocks or other types of birds. Men are not supposed to be the ones dressing up, and in fact, women are not supposed to be dressing up and drawing attention to themselves in public. A woman's jewelry and fine clothes, etc., really should be worn in the home and not so much outside the home. In the Yerushalmi, in Ta'aniyot, for example, it says at the beginning that there was a basoreth, there was a drought in Eretz Yisrael, and they sent two Talmidei Chachamim from Yerushalayim to, I think it was the grandson of Honia Ma'agel. He was obviously lived off the land. He was a farmer of some kind, somewhere probably in Eretz Yehuda, and they were sent to him to ask him special. From the Chachamim in Yerushalayim sent two Talmidei Chachamim to ask him to daven for rain. He was obviously considered a great Hasid and Tzaddik in the following in the footsteps of his ancestors. And they got to his home, and he was out in the field still. And then when his wife who received them was dressed in a normal way and not made up and not wearing jewelry, etc. When she understood that her husband was about to arrive home, she changed her clothes to make herself more attractive and put on jewelry, etc. Maybe she put on some makeup. I don't know. This she did when her husband was about to arrive home. And these Talmidim noticed this fact, and that's why it's remarked upon. All right, so, and therefore from here you also understand, just as it is not a ma'aseh shel ish, not a proper, appropriate behavior of males to remove white hairs by plucking them or cutting them, dyeing one's hair is also not something that men should do. Women can do so as much as they please. Men, no. וכן, that's what Rambam says now. וכן, אם צבע שערו שחור, מי שיצבע שערה לבנה אחת, לוקה. And now, the next statement, Halachot Gimel, refers to cases which are a person whose gender is unfortunately not 100% clear, as with most people. There are such phenomena. Sadly, it is never to a person's advantage to be in that situation. Clearly not. It's rare, but it exists. So the halacha refers to it as well. Tumtum wandroginos eno otef ka'isha. Such a person who is a safek isha, safek ish, at least as long as the safek persists, as we said before, a simple operation can, in some cases, remove the doubt. So such a person should not otef ka'isha, which refers to covering one's head, as women would do. ולא מגלח ראשו כאיש. Nor should they, again, the word here, megaleach, I would suggest, as in the previous halacha, we have the same, by the way, the same two girsaoth. In most sources, it's megaleach. And not megaleach. If it's megaleach, then it means literally to shave one's head. Now, again, the difficulty with that girsa, even though it's the much more common girsa in the accurate sources, is that since when do men shave their heads? There's no requirement to do so. One might, except for pe'otharosh. So I would say, and therefore I would suggest both here and in the previous halacha, mechalea basically means what we would call lesaper, to cut one's hair, how one wears one's hair. So in other words, again, one I think could and should probably understand this to be referring to a woman wearing a man's hairstyle, wearing hair very short, cut very, trimmed very, very short. Maybe Rambam uses the term meghalach to make clear that we're talking about a very short hairstyle. If a person, such a person, a tumtum or a droginos, did so, they are not hayad malkuyot, because it's not clear if they're not allowed to do so. All right, we move on now to another isur, another separate miswach lo ta'aseh, which is halacha, at the beginning of this section of halachot, halacha miswa mem tet shelo lichtov ka'aka. In other words, a tattoo, which is an indelible mark or pattern or some kind of illustration drawn on one's person, on one's body, in the skin, as it's known. We all know how this is done in order that it remain for all time. This is something that was common amongst the goyim, and still is. It's much more popular nowadays, shall we say, than when I was a child. But these things don't go away. They rise and fall, perhaps, in popularity, but they're always there. So, Kedhovet Ka'aka, Amura Torah, which is Asur, who Sheyisrot al Besaro, that a person scratches or otherwise opens the skin in such a manner that you can then place a certain kind of ink or color on it. V'yemale makom hasirita kohal or dio or sha'ar siv'onim haroshamim. Kohal is a dark blue, very dark blue color. Dio is black or other colors, for whatever reason. And Rambam says explicitly, وَزَيْ هَيَا مِنْ هَا غَغُيِّمْ هَرُوشَمِيمْ عَسْمَامْ لَعَبُدَا زَرَا شِلَهِمْ. They would frequently do such things in connection with their Avoda Zarah. In other words, there would be a certain symbol or sign or what have you, which announced their allegiance to this or that religion or belief. كَلَوْمَا شُهُ عِبَدْ مَخُورْ لَا وَمُرْشَمْ لَعَبُدَتَا. It's like a branding cattle, basically. ومعيث شيرشون بأحد من الدفرين هروشمين أحد شيسرات بأيزا مكومين أقوف. If a person does so anywhere on the body, ben isha loka. And this again is an isur Torah and it must not be done. כתב ולא רשם בצבע, או שרשם בצבע ולא כתב בסריטה, פטור, עד שיכתוב ויקעקע. In other words, if the person simply scratched something onto their flesh, some sign or drawing or letter or whatever it might be, without using any kind of dye or color, or the other way around, they wrote something on themselves, but it was not embedded into the skin, and therefore it will eventually come off, it will wash off, wear off. In such a case, that's not considered a ketovet ka'aka. Shenemar uchtovet ka'aka. In other words, it speaks about writing and the ka'aka, which is to embed something in a permanent fashion in the skin. B'med devarim amurim, when is this the case? B'chotev. This refers to a person who does it to himself, that he does makes such a tattoo on his own person. Avazeh shekatavu bivsaro v'kika'u bo, a person who has this done to him by others. Eno hayav ela im siyah. He's only hayav malkuyot if he assisted in some way. Kadesh ya'aseh ma'aseh. Because as we know, there is no hayav malkuyot ever if there is no ma'aseh involved. Aval im lo asa kalum eno lokeh. But if that's not the case, he's not hayav malkuyot. It is possible, hypothetically at least, to be entirely passive in this regard in such a case. That's why this Zarah here is as we just read. However, the fact is, it is difficult to imagine a situation where a person would go to a person to be tattooed and not in some way assist by sitting or lying in a certain position, what have you. So practically speaking, it's difficult to be tattooed and not be chayav malkuyot, I would say. I do not speak from experience, but that is my impression. All right, halacha tet zayin. Hasoret sarita ahath al hameth lokeh. A person who marks or scratches or deliberately cuts their body in any place as a sign of mourning, al hameth lokeh. Again, this is something which is asur min Torah. Shenemar was seret lenefesh for a dead person. Lo titnu bivsarchem. Ehad Yisrael v'ehad kohen. This is true for all Jews. Sarat sarita ahat al hamisha methim, or hamesh saritot al met ehad lokeh hamesh. If it's done with this aim in mind, then each sarita in and of itself is an isur in and of itself. V'hu shehithrubu al kol ahath v'ahath. And to be hayav 5 for 5 saritot, 5 malkuyot for 5 saritot, you would have to have hatra'ah for each one separately also. Now in the Torah, we find two expressions, gedida or sarita. And Rambam therefore tells you that these refer to the same action of slashing, cutting, knocking one's flesh in such a way. וכשם שהיו הגויים סורטים בבשרם על מתיהם מפני הסער, and as Gentiles used to do this, and some still do this in various places in the world. Again, it's interesting to note that essentially none of these practices disappear. They may become less popular in certain societies, but they will always return. And in some societies, they never lose their grip, so to speak. So Rambam says, כל כשם שהיו הגויים סורתים בבשרם על מפני הזר, כך היו חובלים בעצמם לעבודה זרה. These actions were done sometimes for purposes of avodah zarah, and sometimes in order to express anguish and grief. In other words, at a time of bereavement. שנאמר, ויתגודדו כמשפטם. This is with Eliyahu HaNavi on Har HaKarmel. The Nevi'ei HaBa'al got into some such frenzy, and when we're doing such things in order to cause the rain to fall. ויתגודדו כמשפטם. So this was not obviously for reasons of mourning. It had to do with Avodah Zarah. גם זה אסרת תורה, שנאמר לא תתגודדו. This is also a story, even if it's not for purposes of bereavement, for mourning. אלא שעל המת בין שרת בידו בין שרת בכלי ילוקה. If a person does this at a time of bereavement, he is חייב מלכויות, no matter how he did this, whether it's by hand or with some instrument. ולעבודה זרה בכלי חייב מלכות בידו פטור. Because in the psukim that are clearly speaking about using the shoresh God, Gimel Waw Daled, or according to perhaps I think Menahem ben Saruk would claim the shoresh is Gimel Daled. The meaning of the word is to cut. You can even see the connection. Kaf and Gimel, or C in English, are not dissimilar. And T and Dalet are also not dissimilar. The same Mutzah, the same part of the mouth, produces these sounds. So Lagod or Gud Asik or Gud, etc., as it says in the Talmud, it means to cut or to remove. So in those places where we find in certain Pesukim talking about Avodah Zarah, uses the term Vayitgodadu, or some form of that verb, of that part. And therefore, לעבודה זרה בכלי חייב מלכות בידו פטור. By the way, we see this to this day amongst some of the Muslims, the Shiites, the Shi'in. In fact, they have a certain day once a year when, as a sign of mourning on the one hand, and as a statement of allegiance to Ali, the head of their version of that religion, they deliberately cut themselves, and this is considered a very praiseworthy thing to do. And they do it in public, and they strip down, and there's blood everywhere, and it's very, very impressive. At least that's what they think. And so you see, again, these things do not disappear from the human landscape. And it was clearly something that was, like many things in Islam, it was clearly something that was done in pre-Islamic society. And it remained. And it managed to survive the Islamic Revolution, as with many other things. הלכה י"ח או י"ד, ובכלל אזהרה זו שלא יהא שני בתי דינים בעיר אחת. Now, lichora, you may say this, what is the connection? And there is no obvious connection between these two things. Here we're talking about not having two batei din, two halachic authorities in the one town. I know this sounds like science fiction to people nowadays, but that is how things are supposed to be. That there should be unity, at least on the local level, at the very least. so that in each town, each yishuv, each neighborhood, there should be one Beth Din with one set of practices, psakim, etc. Not that the people are splintered and fractured amongst themselves. So Rambam, and this is based on an explicit statement in the Sifrei, in the Talmud, Masechet Yevamot, ובכלל הזרה זו שלא יהיו שני בתי דינים בעיר אחת. זה נוהג במנהג זה, וזה נוהג במנהג אחר. Such a reality where you have different groups within the same society is not healthy. Why? שדבר זה גורם למחלוקת גדולה. That may sound familiar. וכתוב לא תתגודדו, לא תעשו אגודות. Clearly that's not the pshat of the pasuk. It's obviously an asmachta, but it is nevertheless a powerful statement. It's a very powerful statement. Which should provide food for thought for all of us. This, of course, raises the question: what about the fact that you have, shall we say, Ashkenazim and Sephardim, and Temanim and Gruzin and Bukharim, what have you? If we're talking about, it could be a suburb in Brooklyn, in New York, where you have Jews from different backgrounds, shall we say, different whose ancestors came from different parts of the world with different piskei halacha, different minhagim. And it could be true in Eretz Yisrael, where you have a large melting pot, shall we say, of Jews, of communities from all over the world. The standard approach is that olam kaminharo nohech. Everybody must continue the minharim and the psakim of their forefathers, which of course means in practice that this idea of lo te'asu agudot ela hayu kulochem aguda ahat, which is the lashon of the Sifrei. In other words, it's not just stated in the negative; it's also stated in the positive. Lo te'asu or lo te'yu agudot. Do not live and conduct yourselves and organize yourselves as agudot, as separate factions and groups. That is the explicit statement of Hazal in the Sifrei. Clearly, this policy and this approach that Ashkenazim must remain Ashkenazim for all time and Sfaradim must remain Sfaradim for all time, and the same is true for other idot, other groups, other communities. This clearly is not in accordance with this statement and this clear instruction of Chazal. And therefore, the correct thing would be for in each neighborhood or each town to have one halachic authority, and the previous identities of Ashkenazi and Sfaradi should officially be relinquished and would over time disappear. Yes, it wouldn't happen overnight, that is true. Nor does it have to happen overnight. But it should happen. And that, of course, raises another question. If that's the case, and you want to have one halachic authority, one set of minhagim for Jews in a certain place, so who's going to call the shots? Are the Sfaradim going to tell the Ashkenazim what to do, or the other way around, for example, or the Temanim or someone else? And the answer to that, I think, is that it won't work that way, nor should it work that way. And that is essentially the idea behind and the motivation, or one of the motivations certainly behind what I've referred to for many, many years as Torah Eretz Yisrael. Jews, but certainly in Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael should lead the way and show the way when it comes to such things. Jews in Eretz Yisrael should develop and implement a form of Torah, of authentic Torah Judaism, based on all the authentic ancient sources, and do it in such a way that it would be acceptable and seem reasonable and proper in the eyes of all. If people wish, of course, to be reasonable and to act properly and to do the right thing. But if a person is unwilling to do so, then it won't happen. And we live, unfortunately, to this day in a time when most Jews simply do not get it. They are too stuck in their ways, on the one hand, and to a large extent that the blame must be placed at the doors of Rabbanim. Because for Rabbanim, this would require them to actually make an effort. In other words, to get out of their own skin, as it were, and re-examine certain things, and be willing to embark on a new and more correct and more constructive and positive direction. But that would require making changes, or considering even having to make changes, which means that you cannot simply work based on the same playbook as before, and that requires an effort. And most human beings are just not interested or willing to make an effort. But the Torah clearly instructs us to do this. The Chachamim clearly instruct us to do precisely this thing, to make such an effort and to view this as a as a necessary and desirable aim for Jews everywhere. So, Bezrat Hashem, Od Hazon Lamu'ed. We shall stop here.
Yes. Rabbi, yes. How would you respond to those who make arguments of false humility, something along the lines of, who are we to change what certain people have instituted or certain ideas people have had, and thus refuse to change anything?
I'm glad you asked that question. I could answer that on many levels, in many ways. Many, many years ago, I had a conversation with a certain elderly Haredi Yerushalmi gentleman in the Beth Knesset that was next to my home at that time. And we sort of got to know each other over time to some extent. And once we had a discussion which touched upon this point. And I asked him, why do you wear this dress that you wear, this particular mode of apparel? And he said, because this is what my father and my grandfather wore. And I said, that might be so. And by the way, I'm not saying he was dressed improperly. I'm just saying that he was dressed in a particular style. He was what's called Yerushalmi, a long suit and a particular kind of hat and what have you. And he said, because that's what my father and my grandfather wore. And I said, that might be the case, but you should be aware, I imagine, that if you were to go back a few more generations, let's say 300 years, or 500 years, certainly 1,000 years, you would find that your ancestors did not dress in this particular style. He didn't really respond to that. He didn't really agree or disagree, but we all know that's the fact. Clearly, if his ancestors were, let's say, medieval Germany, they didn't wear exactly that attire that he was wearing, which is essentially a copy and paste from the wardrobe of a Polish nobleman in the 18th century. So his ancestors didn't always wear that dress, and if you go back further in time, you would discover it was even more different. He didn't have a response to that. So I said, so therefore it's not true that you may not change, by definition, the type of clothing, shall we say, that you wear, as compared to that of earlier generations, because your ancestors did exactly that at various points in history. Clearly, that's what they did. He didn't know what to respond to that. In general, Haredim and many other people do not have any kind of historical perspective on reality. But he said, I don't know about that, but I do know that I'm not allowed to change. That was his response. I'm not allowed to change from this particular mode of dress. Now, I understand exactly why he wears that mode of dress, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. But the idea that we cannot make any change, and that changes have not occurred over the centuries and millennia, is clearly untrue. That's number one. The same, of course, is true of pronunciation of Lashon HaKodesh. It's not the case. We all know. Again, he wouldn't know this, but we know this, that the way he pronounced Lashon HaKodesh is not identical to the way his ancestors, if you go back many generations, pronounced Lashon HaKodesh. It depends how far back you go, but it certainly things changed and evolved over time, for all kinds of reasons. Now, again, we understand. He would not understand, not being a particularly erudite or intellectual person, but he just knows this is what he was taught in Cheder, and that's what you do, and that's how you say it. Fine, that's as far as that goes, that's true. But that doesn't mean that your great grandfather pronounced it exactly in that fashion, and we know that that's not the case. We even know, for example, of that many Ashkenazim today were originally Sfaradim. In other words, they were expelled from Spain, or they escaped later from Portugal and other places, and ended up in Ashkenazi lands. And lo and behold, after a certain period of time at least, they sound like everybody else. So how did that happen? Well, we know exactly how these things happened. It's called human nature. It's called sociology. It's anthropology. There are entire faculties that can explain all of these things to you in detail if you wish. But it's really self-evident. There are also all kinds of historical, cultural phenomena that bring about such changes. Sometimes very abruptly and suddenly, and other times more gradually. So we understand that this is the reality of human existence, all human existence. When it comes to language, and when it comes to dress, these things are always in a state of flux. But the real reason that people make this argument that, well, we haven't got the authority, or we're not clever enough to know how to change, or what new direction to point ourselves in. The real reason people say this is what I said before, that the real reason is what I said before, that it's the easy and cop-out answer. If you convince yourself that you're not allowed to change, then you're obviously exempt from having to consider the matter. You don't have to investigate what's right, what's less correct, what's more correct, what did my ancestors actually say or pronounce or dress or do on this or that matter 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. That requires an effort, a mental effort, maybe also a spiritual effort, an intellectual effort, maybe a philosophical effort. But if your approach is simply, we are not allowed to make any change, well, that's a very pleasant and comfortable response if your aim really is not to do anything, not to make any changes, not to come to grips with any real life new situation or evolving situation. And the same is true, for example, of many people when it comes to many things. Of course, we all know that on the human level, on the individual level, people will often make excuses for what they do or do not do, and they will explain, rationalize what they do or do not do for all kinds of reasons. But we know the real reason is something entirely different. And I'll give you another example, which has nothing to do with any of these issues that we touched upon today, but it is very relevant, I believe. In the religious Zionist world, for example, they have their own they have their own mythology, just as the Haredim have their own mythology. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about Torah. We're not talking about Da'ath Torah. We're talking about mythologies. It is for various reasons, and I understand these reasons very well. And I'm not saying simplistically that tomorrow all Haredim must go to the army. I'm not going to go into that whole discussion, but that's not what I'm saying. And I understand why we're in the current situation. But it is clearly convenient and desirable and expedient for the Haredi world to have invented new concepts, false concepts in Torah, such as people who study Torah are exempt from military service. That's not true. It's not true for 101 reasons. I won't go into them right now. Perhaps on another occasion I'll devote a shiur to this. The claim that is made based on what Rambam writes at the end of Hilchot Shemitah Yovel, and with regards to Shevet Levi, is in no way any proof for this position. It's rumored, at least, so I've heard, that Gaon Rabbi Issa Zalman Meltzer, who wrote the many volumes on the Rambam called Even HaEzel, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Etz Chaim in Yerushalayim, let's say 100 years ago, or up to perhaps, I don't know exactly, 70 years ago, perhaps. So he wrote, as we said, many books on the Rambam, and it's reported, at least, that he said that I've learned a little bit of Rambam, and I haven't yet found in the Rambam any reason why a Bachur Yeshiva cannot or should not go to the army. He would be considered Haredi, by the way, by anybody today, but that's apparently what he said. And it doesn't matter if that's what he actually said or not, or if that's just a story. That I haven't got proof of that rumor, but it's true. In other words, it's convenient for a certain community or for certain rabbanim, for certain obvious reasons, to make such a claim, because they have a certain agenda, and this serves that agenda. But it doesn't make it true. It doesn't make it Da'ath Torah. It makes it the public policy of a certain group for a particular reason. The particular reason is very simple. We know that. The reason is not because of this or that Rambam, or because of this or that claim that some of them make, but because they are concerned, rightly so, that young Haredi men who go to the army will not leave as young Haredi men, and that the army will bring about a major change for the worse in their entire approach and attitude and way of life vis-a-vis the Torah. And this is not some wild or far-fetched notion. It's very, very real world. That's the true and central motivation, perhaps the only motivation. You could add to that other things, such as they don't identify with this or that, or that's entirely true also. But that's the central matter. So just as the Haredim have that kind of mythology that they create for themselves, the religious Zionists also have their own mythology. In other words, they have their own excuses for everything. So when you begin to point out to such people various problems and issues that exist in Israeli society and in the reality of the Jewish people, and that a certain situation is untenable and unacceptable, and things must change. Often they will say to you, "Kim'a, kim'a," which means slowly, slowly, literally. They will tell you they learned this from the Yerushalmi. They will tell you in Masechet Berachot, where two Chachamim were walking around in the Galil at the time of the dawn, and they began to see the dawn come up from the east. And one said to the other, "Such is the Geula of Yisrael, kach geulatam she Yisrael, kim'a kim'a." That as the light also begins to increase slowly, gradually over time, so it is with the Geula. Okay, that's an important statement which can be discussed and should be discussed, but that is not the real reason why they respond in that way. The reason they respond in that way is because they are psychologically, emotionally, intellectually incapable of doing anything about the problem. En bahem kohot hanefesh. They do not possess that which is required to analyze the situation, see the problem, define it, and then hopefully discuss a true, real, meaningful solution or response to that reality. They're incapable of doing it. So they exempt themselves from having to do that by, just as that Haredi, that old Haredi gentleman, very fine man, I knew him quite well, said, I'm not allowed to change the way I dress. Whatever you tell me about what my forefathers may have done many generations ago, I'm not allowed to change my dress. In the same way, because that's what he wants to do. He doesn't want to change. I'm not even saying he should have changed necessarily, but it's not even up for discussion. In the same way, it's not up for discussion for them to do anything which would imply that the current regime of Am Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael has to be completely dismantled and replaced. They're incapable of discussing such a thing. And why? Because they're religious Zionists. In other words, they're Zionists with a kippah on their head. So you have to accept, according to that ideology, you have to accept the status quo. You have to accept the way things are, and you cannot question them too much. And you have to demonstrate constantly your allegiance to the powers that be. So when they say kim'a kim'a, your problem is with you, not with the reality. The reality is fine. The reality will evolve and change slowly over time, so they will tell you. The problem is with you, because you are in a rush. They turn the whole thing on its head. The person who sees the problem and can define it and analyze it, and also point at the correct direction and the correct approach that might lead to something changing for the better. That person is the problem, because they're in a big rush. Everything is they're never satisfied. They're not patient. Their problem is the lack of patience. So they turn their inability, their lack of creativity, their lack of intellectual capacity, their lack of psychological and emotional strength, they turn that into a virtue. They have all the patience in the world, and they will have all the patience in the world. They will never do anything, because that's just who they are, until they change. As long as they are religious Zionists, they will never be able to conceive of anything truly different. But they turn that into a virtue, and the people who see the problem and speak about it, and therefore see things that they cannot see, they are the problem, because they lack patience. I've heard this. I've had such statements directed at me personally and at many other people for decades. And the problem is not with the people who see the problem. The problem is with the people who are incapable of admitting that there is a problem, which would then require them to do something, perhaps, which they're incapable of doing or they're unwilling to do. So all such arguments, we're not allowed to do this, we cannot do that, who are we, etc. These are all excuses and not reasons. I always distinguish between excuses and reasons. The real reasons for something are often comprehensible, but they're not always the excuses that people make to deflect various ideas or claims or difficult questions. Tov, we shall leave it there for today. B'ezrat Hashem, hayu beruchim, hizku v'yames levavchem kol hamiyahalim l'Adonai. Shalom v'nisachon al kol oivenu mibayit u'michutz.